Okay. This is assignment 6, problem posing case. My name is Kevin Plus.
Amanda Cavanis.
And Jason Townsend.
Okay. So the assignment was asking us to work with our assigned group to answer the following 3 questions. Question 1 was, should the community try to maintain its basic democratic philosophy or establish restrictions to ensure optimal learning? Question 2 was, can freedom be made a basis for learning without also being a potential basis for anarchy? And 3 was, how would you characterize Babcock School of Philosophy? What might you want to change as a curriculum leader in the school?
So, facts of the case. The school's basic operating philosophy is based on the principles of democracy, freedom, and participatory leadership. Zach Miner is the teacher and has 18 years experience with language arts and social studies. He had just transferred to this new school this year. He firmly believes that freedom and human development in the atmosphere is conducive to genuine and meaningful learning. Continued facts of the case. The plan that they had started out well. However, 2 months into it, they faced challenges. They learned that students often surf the web. They would be texting their friends instead of attending to their schoolwork. Many of them had only chosen the elective courses. And in his class, very few students prepared for class and basically just crammed before the test so that they could pass. Everyone in the story, every stakeholder is frustrated. After a meeting, it was learned that the decision for how to proceed was very split. One new teacher suggested ways to restrict the realm of free choice for students and to set up more demanding curriculum maps, a more standardized instructional program, and stricter standards of behavior. Zach was one of several teachers who were opposed to these kinds of actions because he felt it would undermine the democratic school philosophy. So that takes us to our first question.
Oh, hold on, there you go.
And question 1, should the community try to maintain its basic democratic philosophy or establish restrictions to ensure optimal learning? So notes from this, it seems that the current practice isn't getting them the results that they want, just from reading the case study. We only have the information in the case study, so there are other things we could ask, but it seems that change is needed. And as we said earlier in the facts, there is division in how to proceed. So the stakeholders need to be heard, but administration is going to have to make a decision that's best big picture. So thinking big picture, we would encourage administration to look at data and make an informed decision. We didn't really have a lot of that in the case study. So if they just made a decision based on what's there, it would be based on opinion. And from practice, if you just change on feelings, that would fit with, from the video, the Romantic Radicalism movement from 68 to 74. And if you're thinking about the local control, it aligns more with the privatistic conservatism from 75 to 89. And then if you're thinking long-term implications, keeping things the same could really result in a lot of turnover. Staff could feel like there's a lack of support. Families who have the means, it mentioned that they wanted their student to be prepared for the next step. They could choose to move or relocate, and that could hurt your school district as well. So we just want to make sure that they're adequately prepared for the future. Gentlemen, do you have anything else to add on question 1?
Yeah, I kind of thought this whole thing was pretty interesting in that a lot of the text talks about how it kind of portrays neoclassical as, kind of outdated, and you want to be critical curriculum leaders. And this specific case kind of talks about what happens if you take that too far and you almost ignore data and you do too much, right? The school, in a way, kind of became not like an anarchy, but it was out of control and it wasn't working. And ultimately, even in their best attempt to be critical curriculum leaders, it wasn't working. I thought that was an interesting thing. I don't know, Jason, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, and the question says, should it maintain its basic democratic philosophy or establish restrictions? I think in our conversation right before this, as we were introducing it, we talked about the balance between the two, because I think it's important to have that flexibility to adapt to a school's needs, but also you've got to realize that your community, you can have a democratic community in this philosophy where we make these decisions, but your community belongs to something bigger than just that community. The community belongs to the state to the federal union, whatever it might be. And so you need to have that balance so you don't have, I think one of the next questions talks about anarchy. You could have a community in anarchy based on based on what decisions they start to make on their own. They think about the community only communicates the needs of that community and what they want. What Amanda said about administration looking at data and making informed decisions, we're looking for the greater good of education. So when you balance the two, you come up with these decisions that fit the community and also the greater good of education and the world in general. But I think when you get communities and stuff, they're making these decisions that are outside the fence. You can really screw up a group of kids because then they could try to go on to do their next thing. Well, the community thought this was important, and this is how we should teach, and this is how we should do this. Well, they get out of that community and they realize, I'm not prepared, I'm not this. So I think should they maintain its basic, or should they establish restrictions? I think the answer is both.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like a defined autonomy.
Right.
All right, I'm gonna go to the next one, but unless anyone has any other questions or comments about this one.
No, I think that's good.
All right. So I'm just going to read question 2, and it's, can freedom be made a basis for learning without also being a potential basis for anarchy? And then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of read my notes, and then we can springboard off that. So in the context of the case, as it appears to be a point of contention, it will be important to maintain certain levels of freedom. However, the current path cannot continue. That's kind of what Jason was talking about earlier. So freedom in this case must be provided in a defined autonomy rather than wide-ranging curricular freedom. While it's important to listen to those arguing for continued freedom, in this instance, a change is necessary, and that likely will upset current stakeholders, because obviously some people in the community, this freedom didn't come from nowhere. I mean, it came from people's thoughts in the community. And so being data-driven and defining areas of autonomy and including collaboration from all stakeholders and what the defined autonomy means will be pertinent to a successful rollout. So to directly answer the question, yes, in large organizations, too much freedom can result in negative outcomes, such as the one we are seeing in this case. So
I think the only thing I would add to that is balance.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be balanced, and you have to look at all the factors, kind of like what we said in the last slide also.
Yeah. And a lot of times in modern curriculum, especially post No Child Left Behind, the word fidelity has been used a lot. And there seems to be people, and this is going to be surprising in society, but there seems to be people in both camps. People that are like, hey, we should not have any fidelity, and people that say we should have fidelity to a T. And I think that word balance is important because it provides that fence. Okay, well, here's our anchor resource. Here's this. Here's our framework we're working within. But also making it so it's not so tight that you can't make decisions for kids. I think the hard thing is when you give people freedom, it's that whole take an inch, take an inch, give a mile, or
give an inch, take a mile.
Give an inch, take a mile. It seems like that. Like, oh, we don't have to follow this anymore. We can do what we want. And I think trying to lead a diverse group of teachers in the way they think in that process, if you don't do it right, it could be potentially damaging too, because then you get people going off in 15 different directions. And that was an unintended consequence. And I think that's why things move a little slower in schools and with curriculum, because you have to make little changes and then see what happens and a little bit more change.
I think something else that comes to my mind anytime you're trying to get a new curriculum in, if you have people operating as independent contractors, or if you're trying to sustain it, everybody's doing their own thing. And I think, Jason, in the first group you and I were in, we mentioned, if you have a set of twins and they're in the same school in different classroom, right. If they're getting very different experiences and they go home and the families see that's the experience they're getting, that doesn't set well either. So kiddos need to have an equitable education, even though teachers can still have, some autonomy to be themselves and a little bit of freedom.
Right. And going back to the definition of what education is for, I think that's where you get the balance. Yes, we want, I think, it talked about at the end of it talked about at the end of that chapter, what was the word they used? He talked about how one of the principals didn't view success as, which actually goes to the third question. So we can go to the third question if you want,
okay.
If you guys are ready for that. But it talked about the philosophy, but I think a belief that success goes beyond test scores. Success is a human willing and able to engage in a changing world. And so I think going back to a definition of what you think and what your beliefs are as a district or a community or whatever state of what education is, it actually encompasses that balance. Yes, we want them to have interest based, whatever it might be, resources, skills to function in a community, but you also want them to have the skills, the minimum functioning skills and standards to be able to be successful anywhere if they go. So that also promotes balance. But question 3 is, how would you, Babcock school philosophy, what might you change as a curriculum leader in the school? And so Babcock school philosophy was like a lot of the schools, a shift from more creative, loose curriculum constructs to a more formalized, standard-based, and then back. But they then, after they were tight, they initiated a progressive curriculum process. At least that's what I understood when I read it, kind of jumped from school to school. And it talks about this developing a critical consciousness and replacing the idea of fatalism due to state assessments. Like, hey, this is your destiny, this is your whatever. We're going to give them some freedom, more democratic process so that they can see that it goes beyond test scores. Parents and business leaders and staff engaged in these conversations regarding the current state of learning. And it was kind of split, I believe it said there was a business leader in there that was ability, and then you got some minority parents that were like, well, this isn't working for my kid. And then you had school personnel that would say, well, this is the policy and this is what we're functioning in. So pretty status quo for what you are, or stereotypical of what you think a conversation would go. But as more meetings held, they started to have more conversation as well. But it also made a mention that the principal appeared to put less of an emphasis on instructional leadership and more on a community advocate and political mediator. So less about, hey, let's go in and see what's going on in these classrooms and how the curriculum is working for kids. And that's an important thing to come back to here in a minute. But the philosophy of the school ultimately was a freedom and democracy. Some parents voiced concerns about state assessments, but that freedom and democracy is what Zach was wanting when he came to this school. And then they had these conversations, and these parents were saying stuff about test scores. But the principal appearing to put less of an emphasis on instructional leadership is important, because I think when it says, what might you change as a curriculum leader in the school, I think that's the key right there to providing the balance. Because as a leader, you get to balance, hey, we have this freedom, we have this, but we also have these constructs of state standards, and you get to dominate that conversation, introduce those conversations into staff. And so when the principal didn't put an emphasis on that, I think that may have thrown the balance off. I think to me, the first thing that you might want to change as a curriculum leader is being a principal that's involved in the curriculum and getting to see it hands-on. I'll throw it out to you guys now.
So, I think what you kind of just said at the end, if you're not a part of it, then they don't see it as meaningful. And, you've had leaders in the past where they're always at every training that you have, and you feel like they're bought in and you can trust them. And then there are those where they show up, they make the announcement, they get a picture for Twitter, and then they're out. And so you need to have that trust. So in one hand, you've got trust, and in the other hand, the division that's going to come when that learning curve happens, you have to work towards that. Because throughout the whole theme of the case study, I kept feeling like division, and even throughout our own life and the world right now, all of the division. If we can find something to be united to work towards, we have a common goal. I feel like all of those other little things, because you have relationships and trust, can fall right into place like they need to be. But if you don't have that, then it says, what might you change? I would make sure that there's trust and relationships first.
Mm-hmm. And so, kind of to both your points, I mean, when we're about characterizing their philosophy, like, it's very clearly a kind of a community-based approach, right? Like, they have a lot of stakeholders, which is something that you would strive for. You would want to have people involved, maybe not to this level, but then when you're looking at change, kind of exactly what you guys have been talking about, with the principal needs to be the bridge to stop the division, and that might mean kind of putting on a hat of like the neoclassical back to basics approach, just so you can have a voice to that, so you don't let this thing kind of tailspin into what it's become, And so role, like, you might have the business guys and the parents and the students and all these people, this great community forum, but the principal needs to put on the hat of